Don't you shimmy your goddamn little tail away. Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus. Terminus After Dark, to be precise. And we've got the third mic with Wilkins bashing his head against my laptop periodically. Say hi, Wilkins. And of course we have the black metal guy, the other host, you know.
Yeah, it's me, the black metal guy.
So today we have a Danny Filth request of a record that I'm actually super excited to talk about. It's one that we have mentioned on the show a few times, but frankly it's got so few like meaningful parallels to other records, it's kind of hard to talk about, you know, in any other context. And since I don't think you would mind us saying it, this is actually coming from the drummer of Galicia, who we've covered a couple times. I was talking to him about this last night, and he talks about this one being just a seminal part of him getting into extreme metal, which is interesting, just because this has become a record that's waxed and waned in its hidden gem status over the years. And we are talking about Lykathea Aflame's Elvenefris, originally released on Obscene Productions in 2000. So this is a record that I have a ton of experience with. I think I first heard this record when I was about 14, so around 2004. And that was really sort of the zenith of Lykathea Aflame's popularity. In the mid-2000s, this was a very standard record to have listened to if you were a serious death metal guy. And it seems like over the years, it goes in cycles every few years. It sort of dips back down into the underground. A new generation of people discover it and promote it a bunch. That definitely got boosted in 2011 when the remastered version came out. And it just kind of goes through those cycles. But growing up, for me at least, this was always considered just really almost a part of weird death metal canon. This was a standard thing that serious death metal people would listen to, and now it's become kind of a secret handshake for people who are really in the know.
Weirdly, I think it's getting some attention again now. When I was searching for the record, I found that it's actually been reviewed quite recently by two channels, which are, if you can believe it, smaller than us.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
It's a record people are constantly rediscovering, you know?
Yeah. And I feel like people will probably be reaching more for things like this now that Argos Lent is like one of the most influential bands or something, and that they're like looking for anything like that. So, you know, now people are into Megaus or the what's the one that, like, a band that has, like, kind of like Lykathea Aflame, right? Like, I feel like Intestine Ballism was mentioned in the same breath as them back in the day, right?
Intestine Ballism, at least as far as, like, sort of obscure melodic death metal that isn't melodeath from that era.
And I had not even heard the name Intestine Ballism till that band fucking... Dungeon Serpent referenced them or something.
Oh, that was a big hitter for like the Anus and the Dark Legions Archives crowd back in the day. So a little bit of background info just for people who aren't familiar. So Lykathea Aflame came out with Elvenefris in 2000. It is the band's only release ever. Originally, this band was called Appalling Spawn. And under that name, they released a demo and a full-length, which you can listen to. They're very good, but much closer to normal death metal. But you can see kind of some of these strange melodic ideas coming out, but they would only come to full development when they changed the name to Lykathea Aflame, which was prompted by their original drummer leaving and Tomas Korn coming in to become the new drummer, and he is crucial to the sound of this band, which is why I make special note of it. After Elvenefris, it took, as far as I understand, it took a couple years for it to really pick up steam. It was released on Obscene Productions, which at the time was a fairly well-known death grind label. for Eastern Europe, but it took time to trickle over to the West. But when it did, it was a big deal, and it just spread like wildfire through word of mouth.
This was also sort of I mean, the internet was important then, but in like, if this came out in 2000, right? I mean, well, if this came out in 2000, really, the internet wasn't all that important yet.
Yeah,
like,
it was
I mean, people were downloading.
Yeah,
people were downloading stuff. There were like message boards and forums and shit, right? But like,
it was before peer-to-peer like completely filtered into like the extreme metal scene. So it was definitely a weird era. But
certainly far from the. I mean, like far less internet than in when we were coming up, and way less internet than today. So it's not infinite accessibility. It's a time when like something could come out and then in 5 years be forgotten by people because they literally don't have access to it.
Mm-hmm. But in this case, it really wasn't forgotten.
Yes. Yeah. Like, I just mean in terms of it taking time to get places.
Yeah, it took a while to percolate, but then by the time, Soulseek, stuff like that came around, this was just a standard thing that everyone had. Once file sharing caught on, everybody had a copy of Elvenefris. Everybody knew that it was fucking awesome, and everybody wanted to talk about it for years. So Elvenefris released in 2000, and then basically Lykathea Aflame, who at one point like rebranded themselves as just Lykath, kept promising they were working on new material.
Ooh.
And it became like an Anata or a Necrophagus situation. At one point, Tomas injured his Achilles tendon really badly, so there were some issues with drumming. Peter, the vocalist, he said that he was stepping back from doing vocals. He had played guitar as well as doing vocals in Appalling Spawn. A lot of weird lineup stuff that's kind of hard to track.
Yeah, the funny thing is that the last lineup it shows us is just the two guys, Petra and Tomas, and they, and yet there are actually, so you might think, and it just has a picture of them, so you might think this is mostly a two-man collab, but they actually had like there's just this massive revolving door of very brief members, and the record actually has 4 people playing on it, right?
Yeah, and those are 2 guys who were in kind of the main incarnation of Appalling Spawn.
Got it.
But then again, supposedly this record was all written by Petter. It's hard to tell. Like, there's not a ton of information about Lykathea out there. I mean, you can kind of dig up some old interviews and stuff, but that's a little bit spotty. I don't really know how much they were playing live, like if they were super active. I get the sense that this was a little bit more of a studio band, but it's hard to tell.
I see a Czech guy in the comments saying he saw them a couple times in Prague as a teenager. So
yeah, I think they probably did. I think they probably did some local gigging. I don't think they ever toured or anything like that. Really, so over the years, there's been all these ideas of maybe Lykath is going to do something, maybe they're not. Even now, the rumors are still out there that it's like, maybe something will happen. I'm not getting my hopes up. I think it's probably not going to happen, but it's become a Duke Nukem Forever kind of situation. So Elvenefris. Let's talk about this record, because there's a lot to talk about. And I'm super interested in talking to you about it. So when originally we decided to cover this, I was really curious as to what your reaction was going to be, because I could see you very much not liking this, because this seems to run counter to a lot of the stuff that you like about extreme metal. So I want to explore that, but I also want to explore... This is your first time hearing this record, right? Yeah.
Well, I might have... I remember there was a time when I was just like, you're a kid and you're fleshing out like what genres exist, and I was like, is there melodic grindcore?
Yeah.
I'm almost certain I would have clicked on... If there's any reason I didn't actually listen to this, it was probably just it being described as proggy or happy. But my guess is I would have checked it out at some point. But I have no memory of it. And if I checked it out, I probably just heard the major key melodies and the brutal death snare and was like, well, this is not what I'm looking for.
Yes, well, I'm interested in a couple of aspects. One being... I guess there's two main questions that I have, and I'll kind of present them at the same time. One, you've certainly heard about this record a ton from other people as well as me talking it up over the years. So how does your expectation compare to the actual experience of listening to it? And second, how do you think it's different approaching this record as a really seasoned guy versus discovering it when you come up? Because I think that's super interesting, because I'm a guy who, this was a very early record for me, listening to death metal, and for you, this is after years and years and years of listening to this music. And I think that you can get very different results either way.
That is very interesting. Those are both good questions. Well, death metal guy, I think so how is it different relative to expectations? It's even more unique than I thought. I think if I had to guess how it would have sounded, I would have guessed that it would be more like the sugary or exuberant versions of Dorian kind of more minor scale type stuff. Sort of like perky in the way that sort of stuff that's based on Iron Maiden can sound kind of perky, right? So maybe a little bit more like something in the melodically more like something in the Swedish Black Death or, sort of arrogant thrash, black war metal territory,
or
right?
Just more heavy metal in general.
Yeah. So, sort of like bright versions, bright versions of noble Dorian scale melodies, perhaps to the point of excess, but I kind of figured I would almost certainly like it.
This is pretty universally acclaimed.
It's universally acclaimed. More than that, I know that there is this grindcore thing going on there, and I think, one thing that can put me off of some of the more, say, like the Grenadier record or something like that, or why I don't actually listen to Argosland all the time or whatever, right, is that sort of like sugar sweet kind of thing. And with especially with bands influenced by those, it gets way. Argosland themselves are not so much like that, but certainly with things influenced by them and in that vein, it just gets way too much, and it just sounds weak.
It's
right?
the Sargeist effect. It gets striated, it gets smoothed out.
Yeah. With everyone I guess everyone on the Patron show has heard me say that a million times, right? But like, I guess I knew that because it had a real grindcore influence. If you know that something is like super elaborate melodies and is 50 minutes long and has a real grindcore influence, you assume that there's going to be some incredible density and attack to it, right? That whatever's going on in the melodic department, it's going to be done with a lot of force and with a certain kind of rhythmic dynamism and spontaneity that's often missing from sort of highly from certain kinds of like ornately melodic music. So I had good expectations. I guess it was even more unique than I thought, in the sense that, like, I'm not sure I realized how much brutal death it would sound like. Like, this is specifically like brutal grindcore or whatever, right? And, that's both in terms of the tonality of the drums and the vocals, right? The vocals are primarily gutturals. Maybe entirely gutturals. I mean, there's some singing at times, but I think, right?
Yeah, there's some clean vocals and some spoken word, but there's no like black metal shrieks or anything.
Yeah, there's no alternating guttural and high or anything like that. No shouting. So maybe that was a surprise. And also what was going on with the guitars, which was like, I mean, the dominant tonality of the record is like major key. And like, not like the kind of aggressive, well, it's a very aggressive record in a certain ways, but not the kind of, say, like warlike Indo-European drone major key that you get in something like Astrophase or Drudk.
Yeah, and it's not like power metal-y. It's not very heavy metal really at all, I would say.
No, it's really not heavy metal. That's aside from the fact that it's like fancy, right? This is certainly not punk music. Although the energy kind of survives. It's not really. It doesn't have its head up its ass either, because there is that implicit. It has an implicit punkiness, like some of the best '90s black metal, even when it doesn't sound that punk, right? Like Immortal. Like,
yeah.
You know, like Pure Holocaust is it's not. It's in. You know, it's not punky at all.
The essence of punk flows through it, though.
Yeah, there's an economy to it and things like that. Yes. So this record's just like pretty fucking wild, which I appreciate. And the other thing about the major key melodies, they are just conventionally bright, happy major key melodies. However, there's a lot of great texturing in the chords that makes them gives more emotional texture and depth to those chords, and that increases the tension and heaviness. And there are also there's also just sometimes they just will be playing jangling bright major chord progressions. At other times they might be playing those kinds of melodies, but with just like, really intense death metal trem runs, right? And that's going to sound heavy and sort of aggressively exuberant, no matter how happy the melodies are. And then, as you point out, and as you made sure to note in your notes, and as we're going to talk about with one example at least, the music is not people coming to this now from the tradition of like candy death metal or friendly cat black metal or whatever are going to latch on to certain. If the wrong people get a hold of this, they're going to latch on to like 5 parts of it and replicate those, and that are sort of the most characteristic and cheery and poppy and whatever. But there's
most obviously unique parts of it.
And that's true too. But there is plenty of dissonance and plenty of contrasting minor key melodies, and in part because they're constantly shifting root notes. There are like actual chord changes under the riffing. And so, they could play 3 major key riffs in a row, and if they're moving them around in this chromatic way, that's still going to have a grind and a heaviness to it.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things you are seeing, just to rewind slightly, to give greater context, this is a record, probably more than almost anything we've covered on the show so far, that stands really just outside of other reference points. This is one of those things that really is just itself in whole cloth. It's such a wild, isolated lightning in a bottle thing. The comparisons we're going to have to make to other shit is going to be really far-flung, because there's really nothing like this before it, and there hasn't really been anything like it after it. And I think you're right, especially, looking at both of our notes. I think that the primary stuff here is coming from outside of metal completely. However, it is built completely with brutal death technique and vocabulary, which is what makes it so strikingly unique. It is completely within the technical vocabulary of brutal death metal, but it seems like every creative idea that went into it is coming from outside the style itself. It's very strange. Additionally, so there is a tendency from a lot of people who haven't really studied this record or have just kind of seen it in passing, is to refer to this as, usually with enthusiasm, but it's still incorrect, the happy death metal record. Yes. Which is okay, true in an extremely broad sense, but it does not capture like a 20th of what's going on here.
No, and it's not a light or trivial happiness. It's not the trivial happiness you get when you've like
when you get extra mozzarella sticks on accident.
Yeah, when you've boofed your second chai matcha latte and you got a promotion to head of HR.
Yeah, one thing that I would like to say that I think is so cool about this is, so unlike most metal, this is something that dwells primarily, or at least substantially, in sort of positive emotional wavelengths, but it makes an effort to articulate shades of positive emotion. You know, in tendency, people in...
There are a lot of shades of emotion here.
Yeah, like, creatively, within extreme metal, and the kind of people who are into extreme metal, yeah, we tend to have very intricate thoughts about negative emotions, but we generally don't reflect that on the other side. You know, that positive emotions have equally as much nuance to them. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of that shading in here, which I really like. Happy metal tends to be very primary color. This is not. There's a nuance and a depth to the sort of positive emotion expressed here, because, I mean, the album sort of lyrically and ideologically is about a sort of spiritual journey of becoming.
Yeah. This is completely cool wizard music.
Oh, yeah.
And it is cool wizard music that is clearly, you know, connected to a spiritual quest. It's, you know, yes, it is cool wizard music, and it is, oh gosh, you said something else clever there that I was going to say, build on, but I can't remember what it was. It'll come back to me in a second.
Okay, so, well, while you're getting that, so let's think about, let's
wait, real quick, the other thing maybe this will bring me back to it. The other thing I wanted to do was, oh yeah, like shades of positive emotion. Oh yeah, it's not sentimental.
You're right, it's not,
you know, like, one reason I hate that Grenadier record is they call themselves sentimental death metal, and I'm like, damn right.
I didn't know you hated that record. I thought it was pretty fun.
I think I've decided I hate it. I hate it. There are obviously good riffs on it and whatnot, but, like, I don't care. It's
interesting, like, especially if you, like, read all the lyrics and stuff, because it's got a very strange sort of, like authentically Christian undertone, but with a lot of, like, sort of serious Eastern mysticism tucked in there as well. However, it's not humanistic in that very sort of saccharine modern way. It's interesting.
And you know, some of the sentiment is often it's from a distance, right? There's a kind of nostalgia, or a melancholy longing, or a kind of or a sugarcoating and idealization of things. And this is just very immediate. It just is what it is.
Yeah,
it's not lingering over its positivity or fetishizing it. Neither is it positive about stuff that exists in some, I don't know, you know, in some, like, exterior place, right? It's not being positive about the past, or positive about what could have been, or positive about, you know what I mean?
No, yeah, it's not, it is not a, it is a record with a lot of good feelings. It is not a record about feeling good about yourself. Mm-hmm. It is a record about being good. It is a record about goodness. It's not a record about feeling proud of yourself for being good and accomplishing your goals. It sees goodness as a state of being that is something that is achieved, and something that is, you know, that one has to strive for and to struggle through to get to that place. Like, the lyrics have a tendency to be kind of Englishy, but there's actually, like, remarkably powerful moments on it. Like, I've really loved the final stanza of Shine of Consolation that goes, you even do not know that your home is elsewhere. Inhospitable lands you have called your home. Why can't you search for a home with me? Why do your ears not hear the call of home? Perhaps it's too gentle for them. That's interesting. There's a whole sort of idea there, the idea of like a message of goodness being too gentle for the average person's ears. Like we become so numbed and sort of inoculated to the human experience that we find ourselves unable to even access these kinds of higher virtues.
Have you become so numb you can't feel it there? All you want to do is and be less like, and be more like me, and be less like you.
You get what I'm getting at, though.
Anyway. Yeah, no. I'm not making fun of you. I just had to do the Linkin Park.
Yeah, no, but that is interesting because it has.
Can't you see that you're smothering me, controlling
sometimes, afraid to lose control. Yeah, but so it's interesting because there's ways to do like.
Can I also respond directly to the actual thing you were saying, which was wait. Oh God, my brain is bad. I'm hungover. I'm like thinking clearly but slowly today. That's the hangover.
Well, don't interrupt with the fucking Linkin Park, and you'll be able to keep your train of thought.
Yeah, but all the fans are thanking me.
No, but so it's interesting, sort of like how this threads a sort of needle ideologically, where it represents a sort of like, in a very broad sense, a sort of humanistic perspective or sort of a moralist perspective of good. But it never really moves into like moralizing territory. And I think the essential concept is the idea of goodness as a location one can occupy spiritually rather than a trait. It is a place you have to stay or you have to move toward. It turns the moral or ethical value of a person as part of a spiritual journey. And I think there's something really powerful about that idea that is very sort of like traditionally Western and religious in a certain way, but basically forgotten now. Like that would be a very sort of old Christian perspective.
See it as, I'm not quite sure I get the distinction you're drawing, but you said like see it as a is the idea that it's not, there's a...
That goodness is not an inherent trait that sprouts up from within you, but it is something to attain.
Well, I think a lot of people think that, like, I mean, we are innately, right? I mean, like the equivalent, like, you have a fallen nature and you have to like, there's some potential of goodness in you, sure, but you have a fallen nature and you have to redeem it, right? That's the whole thing where, like, born...
I think a lot of people think that they think that way, but I think a lot of people see things like goodness or evil as a sort of, like, inherent state of being, rather than something that is...
What about the constant effort to like reflect on and critique your own privilege, right? That's like or to like undo your supposed mental colonization or whatever, right? This is like kind of like...
Except that's not goodness, that's social proof.
Right, however, right, so there's like a debate about what goodness is, but you know what I mean, right? That there's this like... The struggle for goodness is deeply built into how people think of themselves, right? That's why, like, when a person, like, who's deeply embedded in these modern ways of thinking senses themselves having a bad thought, right? You're taught that, like, you become good by... Everyone's going to have bad thoughts, and you're going to become good. Everyone's going to notice things they're not supposed to notice, and you become good by transcending that, right? You have to notice it, critique it, get past it, recognize it as part of your fallen nature. That sort of... that seems very much like this constant movement. That's part of the idea of progress as a way of being, right? You're constantly moving towards this receding destination.
I see that, but I guess my argument would be that Elvenefris sort of like depersonalizes that whole process. It is not about the self. There is a self that is moving toward this idea of good, but it is totally decoupled from it is not to achieving goodness is not a matter of assuaging your personal insecurities or positioning yourself in some sort of social way. There is clearly, like, lyrically a codified idea of what goodness is, and it's based off of what seems to be a sort of like virtue ethics, but a very sort of traditional take on it.
I recognize that distinction. I feel like maybe maybe like you formulated it several different ways, and some of them make more sense to me than others. I think that way makes more sense. It's like I think maybe what this record is saying is that goodness is something you are. That's an important part of virtue ethics, right? Like that there's something very concrete about goodness. It's not a set of procedures to follow, right? Whereas the sort of modern or Protestant view is that there are procedures you can follow.
Well, it's not it's not procedural, but it is active.
No, I get that. It's a different kind of activity. You're saying it's something that you yeah, well, it's different rather from being it's active rather than reflective, right?
Yeah,
you're constantly reflecting on, to be a good, rational, moral, modern humanist subject, you have to be constantly reflecting on yourself in relation to the moral law, right? In relation to like freedom and equality and all that. And you have to be continually subordinating, or like Kant would say, right? Is your individual maxim of the will consistent with the categorical imperative? You have to be engaged in this sort of moral ratiocination and algebra all the time, and it's this is much more based on like goodness can be like a character trait, and it's also can be like a place, and not a place in the sense of this like abstract ideal that we're trying to implement in the world, right? That is a formula for happiness and peace and goodness, right? But this sort of like literally like heaven, place like heaven or eternity or Shambhala or whatever.
Yeah, and
that a person can be like who possesses the virtue. Yeah, there's a struggle to possess the virtues or activate them, and that certain people are virtuous and good, right?
And there also seems to be a deep importance placed on like to embody these virtues, not merely to practice them, but a sort of personal transformation in becoming these things. I mean, you've got the song title, "To Become Shelter and Salvation." Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. These are not merely acts that you practice. You fully embody. You give your identity to these virtues, and you experience a sort of transcendence as a result. Yeah,
I get that. You're sort of. There's maybe an idea that, like, whereas in the modern view you have a sort of abstract moral schema that's by definition unable to be realized in the world, right? It's like this asymptote you're constantly struggling towards, right? Even if we attain utopia will never fully be utopia. We always have to keep going to the struggle sessions. You have to attend the commune meetings, things like that. The opposite might be that this, like, say, I think you're making a lot of comparisons to, say, like, medieval or very traditional Catholicism, right?
Yeah,
or
naturally.
or say but I think the other reference point would be, like, Buddhism, right?
Oh, yeah,
or
definitely.
More ascetic Hindu stuff. And
well, that's clearly sort of aesthetically what this is patterned off of.
Yes, yeah. And
you basically have the Buddha in that sigil on the cover.
Yeah, there's Buddhist stuff, yes. There's also references to, like, Egyptian mythology a lot. Sort of like... and basically, like, in these ideas, right, there's a notion of perfection that one cannot just sort of... that, like, perfection is a valid ideal, and that one can basically attain it. Right?
Yeah,
not in the way that God or the gods or Buddha can, right? But like it's an attempt to embody a kind of perfection and become more than just a person, as you're saying.
Yeah,
to become,
ultimate completion.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I mean, the lyrics to that song definitely sort of confirm that.
And one thing that you point out in the notes, and this got really fucking heady for this death metal record, but one thing that you said in the notes that I thought was very important is the idea that within legitimate happiness and legitimate positive emotion is the idea of vulnerability, of a strength to open yourself to these feelings, which is obviously, given my personal life right now, something I've been considering fucking a lot. But it's interesting, like, with that perspective, because that's even reflected in other lyrics. In Bringer of Elvenefris Flame, you have the passage, his eyes shall fill you with energy, his eyes shall permeate behind your walls, and your stronghold shall crash. You will stand before him in your nakedness, and maybe then for the first time you will see it yourself. Which is, that's extremely Christian-leaning compared to a lot of the stuff on this record, but they're acknowledging it itself, the idea of sort of a profound metaphysical vulnerability to access perfection,
I think there's probably Buddhist stuff that also sounds like that.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just saying kind of in the way that it's personalized in this sort of, like, this exterior figure.
Through him, yeah.
But yeah, so that's interesting. Well, I was expecting we were going to do all the philosophy stuff on the back end, but that was pretty. Well,
cool. we can loop back to that. It's
interesting that it's a record that provokes this kind of stuff. It's one of the things that makes it so unique.
And the TLDR is like it's happy, but it's not gay.
Exactly.
It's
it's fucking extreme,
and it's really not poppy. This is this is a very inaccessible record, and many people who might be drawn, it does not, in fact, deliver hook riffs in any way, right? People who might be drawn to, this more fruity kind of black and death metal now will actually have no time for this because they literally don't have the attention span. And they are not simply aren't interested in music that's organized around series of phrases rather than verse and chorus.
Yeah, and with that, should we start playing stuff?
No, we should end the review right now.
there we go.
No, sorry guys, you gotta experience it to really understand it, and only when you've gazed into his eyes will you then realize. But no, let's go. So let's fucking listen to. I've got some reference points for this, but I'll bring them in when they seem relevant, and let's listen to the first track, or not the first track, but the first.
Oh yeah. So let's talk about Bringer of Elvenefris Flame. This is a pretty good. This is the first track I ever heard by the band, so it's one of my favorites, and it is a really good sort of like paradigmatic track for the album. It's very representative of the whole thing. So we're gonna listen to sort of the back half of the song, where they're gonna sequence through a lot of the original riffs in the first half, but modified in a different sequence, different numbers of repetitions. But this will be a good baseline for people to listen to. So as you're listening to this, try to consider you're going to be hit with a lot of major key melodies that are very unfamiliar to extreme metal. But what do they actually sound like to you? Like, can you think of anything that you've heard out there that this compares to? Because it's not coming from within heavy metal at all. This album's so fucking cool, man.
Yeah.
So realistically, in terms of points of comparison, you came up with some in your notes that blew my fucking mind that I hadn't even considered, cool. But I think you're completely 1,000,000,000% correct about. But for me, it's like a lot of these melodies across this record sound almost more like, it's almost more like world music stuff than anything in rock or metal. It's like you get like an Enya vibe off some of this stuff. I mean, these sort of like ecstatic major key melodies don't resemble any of the sort of metal or punk configurations we're used to. It's nothing in rock music. It's really nothing in the vast majority of Western music, apart from certain aspects of classical tradition, and I think that's more structural in nature.
I would actually say that some of those riffs are kind of the big ones there, da 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 da
yeah,
and the thing that runs up to it, the more sort of the thing that's kind of hard to hum, right? It's not the first that like release riff that you were describing as so like, you know, ecstatic or whatever, right? Has, you know, it has the build up to it. I mean, those two really do sound and work like classical music. That sounds like there is a thoroughgoing classical influence here, like on the most sort of patrician black metal stuff of the time, which we can get to in a second. But like, But like here, I don't know, you know, stuff like William Tell, like a cliche example would be like William Tell Overture, or like, or the 1812 Overture. Or even like fucking, you know, God, I missed the big one, the Ode to Joy, right?
Yeah, the extremely glossy stuff that we don't even think about anymore. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, those are all, well, William Tell Overture is maybe a little bit glossy, yeah, but like, you know, 1812 Overture and Beethoven's Ninth, you know, you can't knock that.
No, it's great music, but it's so subsumed into the zeitgeist of car commercials and stuff, we barely recognize it as, like, music anymore.
I guess that is kind of true, and also in metal, it's just not the first thing you're thinking about for, like, classical music. But you could also think about, like, you know, like, I mean, classical music proper before and even romantic stuff is much more major than it is minor key. And if anything, like it almost seems like the major key is this sort of construction of, you know, 18th century aristocratic music, or it's in Baroque stuff too. But like, you know, it's very specific to classical stuff. If you listen to medieval stuff, that's all minor key or weirder. Like, sort of
fully polyphonic, yeah.
Yeah, like it's kind of weird things that we couldn't define as major or minor. So the major key in some ways is like, it's like the default we think of it as, but it's kind of like more recent. But this stuff sounds very like major key runs in, like, say, Beethoven's Ninth, right? That's extremely happy. That is maybe the happiest melody there is, and yet it is very strong and very glorious.
It's
right?
very powerful, and that's one of the most important things Lykathea brings to the table, is taking major key melodies that in some cases are so simple and broad we would probably just discount them immediately, and infuses them with such intensity and such power that it really, listening to this record in a way can kind of change your perspective of the use of major key. It opens up a possibility space that almost no one's accessed, you know?
Almost no one's access in metal, and you know, like, what was, I just had thought of another good example, like classical music example of this. What is it? It's Handel's Messiah. That is very major key and extremely badass. And the lyric, I mean, even the lyrics are like excerpts from the Old Testament and shit, so not really my cup of tea theoretically, but the lyrics are also very sort of, life affirming and powerful, irrespective of theology. It's just badass. It belongs to this whole tradition of sort of like manly, affirmative, major key sort of classical stuff. But at the same time, there really are certain parallels for it in metal and in extreme music, or in weird guitar music more broadly, right? So should I get into that now?
Oh, yeah, sure.
And maybe I can actually highlight that. Maybe I'll like roll it out bit by bit, because I've got a couple samples now. And that like, unless you had anything else you wanted to say specifically about Bringer.
No, Bringer is just like, we're definitely going to be getting into a lot of intricate structural stuff a little bit later.
Yeah.
But definitely something important. Certain structural conceits constantly pop up in this record. One is call and response riffs, like rapid alternation between two riffs. In a lot of cases, it's one major and one minor, creating like really sort of grinding contrast. And the other is sort of chopping up and hybridizing riffs. We've been talking about that a lot on the past few episodes, the idea of having an A riff and a B riff and then a C riff that is two parts of those crammed together, which is starting to slowly become a standard part of extreme metal riff technique. I mean, it's always been around, but now it's starting to get more established. But remember Elvenefris' 2000. Like, this is so ahead of the curve. They have that as like a standardized part of their writing methodology 20 years before people really start picking it up. The other thing is that, just as an aside, in terms of actual influences from within metal, basically the only stuff that's going into this that I can like readily identify is Cryptopsy and Cataclysm. Cryptopsy is by far like the biggest one. Apparently they would often cover Cryptopsy songs when they played live. Tomas is actually in the YouTube comments for this video, where he says that he specifically wanted his snare tone to sound like Flo's on Blasphemy Made Flesh. So it's very interesting. And then we can kind of trace it to that idea of Cryptopsy using strange major key passages in their music. Of course, in their world, it's to make it sound sicker and more deranged by having perky major key stuff pop up in these horrible stories of murder. But it's interesting how they've drawn so substantially from the well of Cryptopsy, Cataclysm, and sort of this Quebecois death metal sound, and come out the other side with something so radically different.
Oh god, yeah, these guys are so chill. Somebody comments, "Snare sounds like the one on Blasphemy Made Flesh by Cryptopsy. I love it." And
there's
Tomas replies, "Yes, I was trying to copy the sound as much as possible." Smiley face with a nose. It's about the most like friendly European thing you can imagine.
That's also how you know he's in his 40s. When you're in your 40s, you do your emoticons with a nose. People have apparently they've done studies on that. That's a thing. The nose gets dropped at one point.
You take your time. You do the nose. It's
not like these fucking Zoomer snowflakes, man. Not bothering to put the nose.
They just do they just do the smiley face with a single parenthesis.
Not
it's
cool.
But yeah. So in terms of other sort of. Right, so you cannot search for anything. Yeah, if you want like the basic brutal death structures coming from Cryptopsy and Cataclysm. Other than that, it's very hard to find direct influences or whatever in death metal. What you can look for, though, is stuff that is analogous and that this is sort of a part of the same moment as. So the first of those would be Ackercock. Like, to a degree that is, really significant. This is less than a year later than the first Ackercock record, Rape of the Bastard Nazarene. That's late 99. the second Agricot comes out just after this. And they're both using specific early brutal death technique and composition and sound quality to make music that has more in common with black metal. Obviously, like with Lykathea, it's not specifically mood, right? There wasn't very much black metal. There wasn't any black metal that sounded remotely this positive at the time. But much more, but more in terms of like, okay, you have music that's based on heavily atmospheric, that's based on serious spiritual and ideological conviction, that uses a lot of texture and melody, and it's drawing on classical music and things like that, right? There's little to no direct black metal riffing influence on this. Agricot actually does use black metal riffs. But another parallel between them is that many of Agricot's black metal effects, we've pointed out, are based on goth. And they're like actually not BM guitar technique. And similarly, Lykathea is very open to non-metal guitar technique, which we'll get into more shortly. The other thing within extreme metal properly, you mentioned later in the notes that like they probably are influenced by symphonic BM. That's got to be true. Just like there was nothing else with this level of classical influence and ambition at the time.
Yeah.
Right? It has to be true. And, one of the dudes is wearing a Dodamsgard shirt in the picture and stuff like that. So that, and in terms of like specific things from that time, maybe it's just on my brain because of the Furton review we did last week, but I've been listening to all those Naglfar records again, and I went back to Hunengrab and Herbst, and now there's like one really awkward track on it that I just couldn't get into when I was younger, but now I'm just like, fuck yeah, this is awesome. So that barrier to entry has been removed, and now I really like that record. And you can hear in the outro track I played to the last episode that it's really on that record that sort of pagan barbarian uses of major key get developed for the first time in BM, as far as I can hear. And very thoroughly. So there's parts that basically just are Druk's Sun Wheel, like 7 years before they released that record. And you can hear it being informed by classical and folk, and they're using drone effects to give the melody greater heaviness. And, on the Naglfar, it's going to have a bit more sort of capital A aggression, martial ferocity to it, sort of wild romantic passion. It's a little bit different from the kind of major key on here, but there's a similar interest in how do you do strong sounding extreme major key stuff that's responsive to the way that classical music is and romantic music is very happy to shift between minor and major keys.
Yeah. And I mean,
there's a technological
essential.
Yeah, so there's a technological development that's happening in the most sort of noble strains of black metal that is also happening here. Then finally, let's get at the extrinsic influence. Well, actually, let's talk about that more after we've done these samples. So, so first I want to play, this whole record has kind of a leitmotif, or like, I guess you could say like a theme. The funny thing is that, like, a certain thing, like, you play a first riff at the beginning, and it's like most of the major riffs are made with pieces of it, or it's continually coming back, right? Those early the first Serpent Column record does that in a really thorough way, where there's like 3 or 4 germinal melodies. Beethoven's Fifth does that, where it's like, almost the first 5 notes of it spits out the whole rest of the symphony. This is quite different from that, in that, like, this riff, which you could call the Elvenefris theme or something, it recurs in a lot of different guises throughout the record, but it's almost completely distinct from every other riff that happens, including many of the biggest ones.
Yeah, it is designed to stand out in a very distinct way.
Yeah, so let's listen to and it immediately sets the kind of Eastern atmosphere, this part of this. So let's listen to the first 50 seconds of the record on Land Where Sympathy is Air. so a little bit curvy sword, a little bit snake charmer.
But what's so interesting is that we were talking via text, and it's like, this kind of predates almost everybody doing that.
Yeah, the only precedent you could find was this is actually earlier than Nile and Nile, and earlier than Orientalist Behemoth.
Yeah, so this is well before Behemoth would start to incorporate that stuff. And then for Nile, the only thing that would have been available... So Black Seeds of Vengeance would have just come out, like a month before Elvenefris, so that's out. Amongst the Catacombs of Nephrin Ka would be available, but some of the songs on this record trace back to 1998. So I don't think it was probably a substantial influence. Like, as I said, the only thing that really predates it, that immediately comes to mind, is the first Melichesh record, which is in 96. And even as far as I know, that very first Melichesh, it's like not a lot of people listen to that one. I mean, they didn't really pick up steam until, second, third record.
It also got more conspicuously folky as they went on. Yeah, I think it's quite likely that they just, Eastern scales have been available to metal people since Led Zeppelin, right? So you can, it's entirely possible that they just did it on their own.
Whipped it up. And it's very clear these guys are probably listening to a lot of 70s prog again, so they could pull it from Yes or Genesis or something.
And
like that.
they probably listen to Middle Eastern music. Now, I mean, the riff itself is obviously very troped, but it's they clearly listen to world music from all over the world would be my guess. And, that's just been a metal or prog guy thing you can do for a long time. They practice their weird scales. So, but they deliver that in a way that, riffs like that can often sound very silly when they're not entirely the fault of the riff, just the cultural context around it, and the way that they're very often it's not necessarily the fault of that style of scale or of Middle Eastern music. It's more like how it's being deployed. This melody, you can hear it's a lot more authentic than your average slinky riff. It's not the most authentic, but more than that, it's everything they're doing with it. So they have they're using drone effect to increase tension and contrast, right? There are these open strings or jangle in the riff itself, and then there's the bass, which is doing this really cool, almost like Concrete Winds-esque kind of non-riff, techno oscillation. Boom, 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 boom. And then immediately they'll pull into, you can use those Eastern scales to generate a lot of dissonance, which is why they're important for good bands like Slayer, right? And here they're doing that. They have the more melodic thing above it, but then they'll periodically just blast a tritone into it, right?
Well, that's something worth mentioning also is in anticipation of this, I took some time and I was looking at a lot of tabs for this record. Some of the chord voicings on this fucking record are shit that I have never seen in metal guitar before. There's chord shapes that are completely unfamiliar to me. And there's also, I think some of it's kind of jazz inspired, and some of it's probably flamenco, some of it's probably Middle Eastern stuff.
The Czechs like jazz.
Yeah. And there's also, one thing that's interesting is there are parts of this record that are extremely technical, but for the most part it's actually not super tech from a guitar standpoint. But that it's not easy to play because there's nothing idiomatic to death metal or extreme metal as a whole. You would have to rewire your brain to play these riffs naturally, just because the sorts of intervals they're playing with don't make sense on paper because you're just so fucking used to doing things the usual way, you know what I mean?
Yeah. There's the other influence here is probably techno. There's a goofy techno part used as the climax to think the main riff sort of blends into a techno version at the end of On the Way Home.
There's something just very strange happens there.
If you were in Eastern Europe in the late 90s, you were probably going to raves.
Yeah, you're going
and that's probably
to the discotheque. And,
they may have been on ecstasy, is what I mean, and that might explain something about the mood of the record.
That would be sick if this was just this is what happens when you do a death grind record while just rolling your fucking face off.
I would not be that surprised. And you can hear it in the bass line there. You can hear it in the drumming, which at the end of those phrases goes.
Oh yeah.
You get this sort of breakbeat cymbal, jungle beat cymbals.
We'll talk more about the drumming later. It's fucking incredible.
So that's kind of the main leitmotif for the record. And so, how else do I get into these other influences? So, that particular riff, no, let's just go to the next track, and then we'll get into the non-metal stuff. So, now that I've introduced that theme, we can play a place where that theme comes back, which is in On the Way Home. On the Way Home is another one of the calling card songs. It's probably parallel. It's basically parallel to Bringer of Elvenefris Flame.
Yeah.
They sort of work in roughly. They're structurally sophisticated. They have big, bold, major key melodies. It's probably the kind of thing someone would sample to show you this band.
Mm-hmm. And it's also, it seems clear that certain songs, you can kind of tell the era that songs were made in. I'm guessing because there's old versions of Shine of Consolation and To Give out there, which are two of the shorter tracks. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing Bringer is another older one, and then On the Way Home is sort of the renovated, expanded idea of that archetype.
Okay, cool. So yeah, this is going to be it's a bit more involved. It's a bit more aggressive take on the same template. So I have
the work you did on this, dude.
Well, thanks. I tried to diagram Did you see me attempting different kinds of notation and giving up?
I was watching you in the Google Doc, and I was kind of cackling as you were just like, wait, hold on. I could just picture you rewinding in 20-second chunks trying to figure out what the fuck is happening.
Yeah. So I mapped it out on... Maybe we should print this in the we should honestly print this in the comments or in the description.
Yeah, no, because it's going to be way easier for people to read along with the notes of the individual riffs and stuff. Yeah, I'll throw it in the description.
I'll explain the notation after we play the sample. But basically, I spent long enough listening to this to realize that it was impossible to diagram and then diagrammed it. So the one conventional thing they're doing here is that the default is 4 reps on almost everything unless otherwise noted. So let's get into it and listen for it'll be very hard to miss when a version of the Elvenefris theme pops up. even as we were listening to it, I realized that, like, I think I hadn't finished the diagram, and, like, I tried to change the notation to make it clearer for people, and now I'm just fucking confused. Which maybe proves my point. But, I guess the really staggering thing about this passage is that none of it, you can hear that a ton of things happen, and that, they actually all make sense. Mm-hmm. And this is just incredibly intricate. So you get, like, I've noted it, like, in terms of, like, A and B and C and riffs or whatever, where, like, a prime marks a variation on a thing. So C prime, like, the prime's the little, like, you know, quotation mark kind of thing. And I've outlined it with, if one part is being put under another, I've actually put it under the other part in the notation. And I've, and if they are next to each other, that means there's a kind of, like, two things that we've already heard are being, like, fused.
Yeah.
So
it's tricky as fuck.
Yeah. So
it makes perfect sense while you're listening, but it's so hard to write out exactly what's going on.
I'm pretty sure about the diagram through GB, and I might have to fuck with it at the end, like after we finish the segment. But let me get to it. The other funny thing is that sometimes they introduce a variation on a riff before you actually hear the riff. Mm-hmm. So A, right? We hear that jinga jing jing da jing da jing jing da ding ding ding. So that is this sort of, like, it's a jangling major chord with drone strings. The drone strings are, like, I don't know, you know, with, like, shoegaze chords like that, you're often droning, like, a seventh of some kind. And it's sort of, often it's like a major seventh or something. So, like, it's actually only, like, one half step under the root. At least that's what I remember from trying to figure out how those things worked when I was, like, 18. But so that's like a shoegaze drone riff. That comes from, like, My Bloody Valentine.
And that's the one that fucked me up when you wrote that out. I was just like, oh my god. The moment I saw that written down, I was like, you gotta be fucking kidding me. This is Loveless. That's where a ton of this stuff is coming from. I just never thought about it because metalheads weren't fucking listening to Loveless in 2000, dude.
Well, so that's a thing, is that it's, I never got to that thing where you asked me, like, what's it like listening to this, like, when you're, you know, not just when it's just came out and when you're first getting into metal, but, like, now, when you're seasoned. That's one difference, is that although this certainly is just about as unique as any music gets, I can hear more influences and more parallels. It doesn't sound as Sweden, as totally singular to me, because, I mean, if I had heard this when I was 17, it would have sounded totally... Well, I actually wouldn't have been, because I was listening to the shoegaze stuff. But, a bunch of other stuff about it probably would have seemed totally unique to me. You know, like the snare and whatever.
Well, that was just the crazy thing, was realizing, like, a lot of those more mid-paced sort of open drone passages, that's fucking Loveless minus the delay. And it's crazy to think that just, like, having such a radically different production job makes that so difficult for someone like me to recognize.
Well, it's not just the production job, although for sure Loveless is very much a production-oriented record. It's also... But, you know, there are other shoegaze records that have that kind of jangle more prominently, not obscured by delay. So the first record Isn't Anything, but MBV also has that to some degree. The songs are all a little more sort of brooding and gothy, but you can hear sort of more harsh, jangling versions of the drone. And the main influence for them, which Lykathea were probably also listening to, would have been Sonic Youth.
Yeah.
So Sonic Youth had kind of, certainly that kind of, like, you know, they would use modified tunings, and they were very interested in drone effects.
This is a very culturally Euro record in a very distinct way, you know.
Yeah, long before it was cool for everyone to say, like, I listen to, in fact, I'm on Rate Your Music, I listen to everything. I may be a metalhead, but I also enjoy the most obvious classics in every other genre. There is especially country and hip-hop, but not country. And the, and like, but yeah, so this was very broad influences. And the other thing that is a reference point for this record that is influenced by My Bloody Valentine and by the shoegaze bands is Smashing Pumpkins. Which I think, if it's not a direct influence here, it easily could be. And you can hear Smashing Pumpkins doing sort of really heavy major key drone stuff on songs like Silverfuck.
Yeah.
Which, again, does the same thing. It does it more with raga scales, and it's actually way heavier than the, like the Elvenefris theme sounds like a fucking, it's being played on kazoo compared to, like, the Silverfuck riff. Yeah. Which is, like, instead of being, like, sounding Middle Eastern, the Silverfuck is like a raga scale, like major tinged raga scale drone, and it's just, that song is crushing. But also totally ecstatic and exuberant, and just makes when you like jump up and down hearing it. So that's a whole, and there are other shoegaze bands that you could associate with this, like the major key jangle stuff in Ride for sure, or I mean also of course. Slowdive sounds quite different, but there will be similar chords.
Yeah, Slowdive is a little bit too kind of sweet and femme.
It's darker and folker, I would say, is the main distinction.
Yeah. I don't say that to knock it. I love Slowdive. Yeah.
It's not as like My Bloody Valentine has a kind of like loud rock and roll thing that is like not what Slowdive was striving for.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's one of the reference points. I mean, should I talk about this? I could play an MBV sample for people. Should I just do that before I get into the rest of it?
I would like to hear it just because I clicked on it out of curiosity, and inside of 2 seconds I was like, fuck. God damn it, it was right in front of me the whole time.
Well, it's, I checked through, at least the beginnings of the tracks on Isn't Anything, too. And I checked through most of this record. This is the best match for it, and this is also one of the heaviest My Bloody Valentine tracks. It's probably my favorite on Loveless. This is Come In Alone, just the first minute or so.
And like Elvenefris, Loveless is one of those records that actually is as good as everyone says.
That is true. Yeah, you can't knock it.
I would love to be a contrarian, but no, it's that fucking good. But yeah, dude, no, you're exactly right. I can't believe all that weird fucking drone jangle stuff was like right in front of me. That's awesome.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, the other thing about and that's also more evidence for the notion that these guys were taking a lot of ecstasy. It's like, damn, man, we're in this band called Appalling Spawn, and, we used to think that, fucking, having kind of like horned helmets and sick barbarian axes was really cool. But lately, I just want to like be kind and help people.
It's funny how, like, if you go read Appalling Spawn lyrics, like, they're clearly trending toward Lykathea Aflame, but they're describing the ideas so much more aggressively. Like, the first song on the Appalling Spawn record has Peter, like, saying, "kill sadness" over and over again. It's just so great, the idea. They've always been revolving around the same ideas, but they were slowly learning the language
That's
that
interesting.
didn't involve murder as the way to communicate. I'm learning how to pet the rabbit without crushing it.
Yeah. So that's that. But then, you know, in terms of the structure, you get like right after that, you get the Elvenefris theme, but it's not the it's not the whole you know, it's or rather, no, that's what it is on this track. God, it's fucking confusing.
Yeah, it's that.
Basically,
it's not the
as
Snake
it appears,
Charmer version from the beginning.
as it appears on the Snake Charmer, it's part of the Snake Charmer riff. It's based on the second phrase of the album's first riff, and that's expanded on. And that's happening over the My Bloody Valentine drone thing, right? The thing is that like drone chord thing is so distinctive, it stands on its own as a riff, and then there's this kind of like drop of the Eastern stuff over it. Okay, then the drone continues, as a drone is wont to do, and you get the you get like a sort of like full shoegaze chord progression, major chord progression being played out over the drone, and it's getting its tension and heaviness in part from the drone. And also just, you know, from the rhythm and from being well selected chords. But the then you get another B section. So we get the Elvenefris theme again over the same drone riff. Then we get C prime. So we get the the shoegaze progression, but now it's over downbeat thrash. Then we get this sort of slight, more minor key, but sort of more like spicy than aggressive minor key. And it's this sort of like bar chord, sliding, sweeping bar chord thing. It's almost kind of flamenco.
Yeah.
It starts at like a dominant seventh or something.
I think there's like a lot of subtle South American stuff that permeates this record, especially in the drumming. Because Tomas Korn's style is clearly, he's gotten inside Flo Monnier from Cryptopsy's drumming style, but there's so much sort of like ragged salsa and funk rhythm stuff that goes on. Like you pointed out earlier, he like one of his identifying marker is that sort of almond break fill he likes to do at the end of extended blast passages. A lot of his stuff, his scanning is very like salsa inspired, and it's just one of the really cool, weird cultural reference points of this music. But yeah, I could definitely see flamenco like permeating all this stuff.
Yeah, well, cool. So yeah, so we get the yeah, that makes sense to me. And you know, yeah, if he's such a good drummer, he's going to listen to drummer stuff like Santana or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But the okay, and then you get a thing that I'm calling E prime, because it comes in before you're getting the variation before the thing, and you get this weird call and response thing. There's a slow introspective part, and then you get like a this kind of a death metal riff, and that repeats twice, and then half a time, and then the place where that more death metal-y part would be happening, suddenly we get E, the full death metal riff. And it has call and response built into it. So the first part is this kind of really grinding, dissonant chorded part that sounds like it's being played backwards. This is one of many parts on the record that kind of remind me of Portal in this weird way.
There's a subtle
There's another band that like clearly has influences but is totally unique.
Yeah, there's like listening to this again with that in mind, there's definitely a subtle undercurrent of at least like an appreciation for like NYDM stuff like Immolation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's
that would make sense for sure.
Executed in a really different way, but there's just these subtle things about the way they arrange chord voicings and stuff that remind me of that.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense, actually. So, yeah, so you get this sort of like skronked out chords, and then the ending of the phrase is this more like, this trem run. And that is the part that, it's like the E prime thing, the second part of the previous riff, of the intro riff, is phrase 2 of riff E. It actually makes sense. It's just so complicated. And, the mood here, this is one of the only parts that sounds like regular death metal. Like, that's like, it's a mode they'll pull out once or twice in a song, and, like, it's the only place where you get, like, here it sounds the most like kind of Swedish Black Death Spectrum stuff. Like, this is kind of like At the Gates or Liars in Wait or Sentenced, which is Finnish, but Swedish secretly. There's your kind of like Hessian firm dark metal riffing, and whoa, it's gone because it's time for more shoegaze. All right, that's F, and then you get through like, it's slow again, and you get like through, and they start working through a 4-part chord progression, and they get through 3 parts of it, and then bam, riff, and so again, they do the same thing where like the end of the phrase is actually the beginning of another one, and they don't like, there's just they'll gesture towards a 4-bar idea or whatever, but then just like a new 4-bar thing will start generated out of the end of the last one. It's just continuous, like one riff is flowering out of the last. Mm-hmm. So this one is kind of Kashmiri, basically. It's the Kashmir format. And it's also call and response, and it uses the Elvenefris theme as a turnaround. It's the, except here, I think it's based on the here it's based on the first part of the Elvenefris theme, which is not in the fucking song. Like, it's in the first song on the record. It's not the same riff that started the song. And again, there's this strange continuity going on. There's still the 3-to-1 ratio that the previous riff suggested. So you get 3 reps of this Kashmiri thing and then the Elvenefris theme, which is what how the shoegaze chord progression worked. And then there's a part of my notes that's confusing me, and let's just stop.
It just occurred to me that it's like, now I'm just thinking of this grab bag of reference points, because you were talking about electronic music. I'm betting that they were probably also like really into like early IDM stuff. These guys probably listened to like old Aphex Twin a lot.
Oh, probably, yeah.
Like, let's see, when was Selected Ambient Works? Man, I always forget what year that is. That was 94, so yeah, they had plenty of time to listen to Selected Ambient Works. So, yeah, what the fuck, man? But yeah, no, it's like, and then I was thinking,
I guess he had already done some of his more Aphex-y stuff too, which was probably also influencing them because of the breakbeat stuff.
Yeah, but also melodically, there's going to be some of that in here, like that album, or I Care Because You Do, that kind of stuff, the more melodic Aphex Twin stuff, with all the breakbeats and shit, where he was doing, something kind of more akin to drum and bass. There's that, and then I was also looking it up. It looks like, the obvious thing for Cryptopsy is going to be the first couple records, but Whisper Supremacy comes out in 98, like, as they're sort of writing this, and that's where some of the really crazy breakneck structural stuff comes in, like the half repetitions of riffs before it snaps into something really abruptly, so that could be going on here. It's But the thing to emphasize is how contiguous this all sounds while you're listening to it.
Yeah, so this is not random. I guess that's the impression I'm trying to give people.
Yeah, this is not like schizo tech death at all.
It's kind of it's totally the opposite of that. It's less random than a number of things with simpler structures. It's very close to how a romantic symphony works, which is like, this is kind of the use of and that use of symphonic structures as opposed to like symphonic orchestration or superficially classical sounding stuff is starting to become more common. Well, in relative terms, it's starting to be done more in bands like Naglfar around this time.
Yeah.
You can maybe Dawn sort of does that, but those kind of work more like really elongated, just strange. Those just work very differently from conventional songs, but like some of the Naglfar stuff really does have this kind of like A and B theme trade-off and transformation stuff going on.
Yeah, there's this very kind of there's something very structurally intricate yet like immediate and impulsive about these songs. Something like highly organic. It's like describing the shape of a tree's branch is like almost impossible to do verbally, but it makes perfect sense when you just look at it.
Yeah, that's the organic structure thing. That's a very good way of putting it. That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, it's well. I mean, I've always associated this record as being like very nature-y in a lot of ways. In the way that like pagan black metal is. It's one of the things that makes it so unique.
Yeah, that's probably one of the connections to the Naglfar stuff. Like Hunengrab im Herbst is very nature-y.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the major key stuff, but that's such a fucking cool riff. It doesn't make any sense if you think about it on guitar. But
speaking of which, that is going to bring me to my last non-extreme metal reference point, but I'll get to that at the end.
Well, I wonder if it's the same one that I was about to bring up, which is I fucking guarantee it's like there's certain riffs on this that I swear to God are like Super Nintendo chiptune type stuff.
Well, that's related to what I was going to say, but it's not the same thing.
Okay, because there's definitely stuff that it's like, this sounds almost like music from Sonic the Hedgehog or something.
Oh my God, I was playing some part of the Naglfar record, and my girlfriend was just like, that sounds like Sonic the Hedgehog.
No.
It might have been one of the keyboard melodies, but it might have been one of the riffs. It was just hilarious.
I mean, I could totally see these guys being like early adopters of like, all these fucking video games we're playing, let's throw some of that in there too, man. It works perfectly. So anyway, we've talked plenty about like the major key riffing and stuff, and obviously that is the giant unique centerpiece of the record. However, these guys never forget that they're a death metal band for too long. We don't sample a whole ton of the like more grinding and dissonant stuff, but it's there and it's crucial because it's what gives the major key parts their liveliness. They have to be bursting out of shadow for them to have the sort of gripping effect that they do. And also, it's not just this is death metal. This is fucking brutal death metal. The grinding blast beat passages are very extreme, even for 2000. The vocals are purely cut from like Lord Wormcloth of just that like roaring bark, like super guttural, super intense. There's passages that are like borderline slam riffs across this, and sometimes they'll jostle the ideas together, so it's like this really gnarly sort of palm muted slam rhythm, but with those major key chord phrasings, resulting in just some of the weirdest sounding shit on the planet.
I feel like the vocals are the only part of the record that you could say are maybe kind of incongruous with the themes. Like, I mean, otherwise they basically just prove that there's no reason Brutal Death can't sound like this. It's kind of hard to figure out how gory gutturals fit into this picture. However, they don't really fit on a conceptual level, but they fit on a musical level, for sure.
I guess I just think of it, if I try to come up with a justification for it, it's that it conveys a sort of like animalistic life, you know? It conveys, you know, it is there to be intense and high energy. Like,
no, I think that would be true. I think that's probably true. I guess I mean, like, you could have any other kind of harsh vocal might make more sense here.
Yeah, but I do think it fits the music most congruously.
Yeah, and it also, it just sounds sick. And it's one of those kinds of, the whole record plays on this kind of unexpected juxtaposition. Like, what if this was that? And that's just like the most extreme version of it. And it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, sure, that is animal intensity. That can be sort of an expression of life, I get it. So yeah. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that's the one part. This is the one part of the record that, like, this isn't an eccentric record. That's the one element of the record that you could say is a little bit eccentric, but it's awesome.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a record that, while it's very alien from most of what you experience, it's totally in touch with itself. So anyway, so I did want to sample very distinctly a part that is very harsh on this record. So I want to go to the first couple minutes of Flowering Entities, which has some of the darkest material on the record. And we're going to listen to basically an extended instrumental passage where a ton of shit happens, and through some of the most brutal stuff on the record, they find their way back to the major key in a convoluted but in no way forced series of incredible riff transitions. So, man, a ton happens there. Like, that's some of the most intense, like, kind of techie death grind stuff on the record. And it's amazing how they're able to very naturalistically develop all those super churning, really extreme ideas toward the rest of the song. I mean, this is one of the shorter tracks on the record. And about the first half of it is just this extended instrumental passage that gives the band access to some of those major key melodies. Like, in and of itself, just those first couple minutes are better thought out than almost anything you hear today. And again, didn't fucking realize it until we heard it again. It's the goddamn Elvenefris theme. Again. popping up as like the second riff of this song, you know, a variation on it again. Do you think there's a variation of that on every song on the record?
I don't know, but that wouldn't surprise me. Here, they've changed it because they've, like, inverted some things or whatever, so it sounds way more chromatic and death metal-y.
Yeah. It's in a radically different key. But I just want to emphasize, the thing is, like, this has such a reputation as being, like, flatly described as the happy death metal record, like I said, you know, earlier on in the review. But there's such depth to what's going on. There's such narrative depth in these song structures. There is so much intricate play in the contrast between, you know, harsh dissonance and really beautiful soaring major key stuff. And the way in which these guys are able to thrive on the abrupt transitions between those ideas is something that's really special.
This is not like a, you know, it would be easier to do a track that was just like, okay, let's just do like a more death metal-y song, right? Mm-hmm. And you could still fit that within the overall theme. It's like, okay, we're just going to have a dark part. But like this song, I mean, this is one of my favorites. It might be my favorite, but like it's also a microcosm of the whole. Right, mm-hmm. That's another aspect of the organic structure thing. It's significantly varied, but like by the time we get to that sort of cascading arpeggio thing, right, we are back in sort of like, you know, crisp clouds and rushing through a blue sky territory.
Yeah, and
it's
there is
like it's very economical, and yet it has some of the most, that is one of the most poignant moments on the record, really.
Yeah, and I like that you point out that it would be very easy for them to say, let's just have a dark death metal track. But there's an incredible commitment to the conceit of the idea of this record. This is constructed in a very top-down way, which is usually a recipe for stuff that's really cool on a meta level and structurally, but is really unsatisfying moment to moment because it kind of loses the physical energy of the music. But in this case, they've managed to preserve that, like, pretty much completely, despite the fact that this is operating, like, clearly, like, conceptually first. I would love to know how these songs were written. Yeah. Like, because they have such a jammy quality, but they seem like impossible to jam, you know? I can't imagine what the writing process of this is like, especially considering that the goddamn Appalling Spawn album came out in '98 and this came out 2 years later.
It's, watch the band be like, we can't either.
Just like... This is a 70-minute record, and they just crushed through it in 2 years.
I think actually it's 70 minutes with the bonus tracks. Or wait, no, it's 80 with Icy. Yeah, it really
it's 80 with the bonus tracks. Yeah,
it really is 70 minutes. Yeah.
By the way, a quick aside that I didn't mention at the top. To clarify, the samples that you're hearing and what we're listening off of are from the 2011 remastered version. Mm-hmm. Which is, it's a really good remaster job. It's it's brighter, it's got more tone color, it's louder and kind of wider, of course, but if you listen to the original version, it's very much intact. So I just wanted to note that for anyone who is wondering. So yeah, for people who like their death metal, there is plenty of that on this record, and it's executed masterfully as much as the crazy melodic stuff is. So for my last sample, I want to bring up kind of the specter of black metal lurking in the background, because what's interesting is Tomas Korn, as well as the keyboardist, the session keyboardist on this record, who is the brother or the cousin of Petr, I can't remember, actually ended up in Cult of Fire, which Tomasz just left this year, but he was the drummer on basically that band's entire discography up until now. And based on, the idea that, okay, guy's wearing a Dotheimsgard shirt in one of those recent photos, there is, like, black metal lurking in the background of this. And it seems to have very subtly informed some of the decisions across this record, especially in the synth work, which is pretty omnipresent. It's subtle, but it's continuous across this. These sort of atmospheric, very, again, 90s electronic style synth pads that provide a lot of lush texturing and some extra harmonic color. So I want to go to A Step Closer, which is part of like sort of a suite of 3 songs at the end of the record. There's some of the longer songs, and they're clearly designed to function in a dovetailed way. So on A Step Closer, pay attention to some of the most immediate and like primary synth stuff on the record, because I think that this has to indicate like a substantial influence from like symphonic and industrial black metal of the period. So yeah, not only you pointed out that this is probably coming from like Arcturus, I would throw Borknagar into the ring there too, like early prog synth black stuff.
Yeah, Borknagar might be the more accurate reference point for all I know.
I think it could be any of them because they're about contemporary. Both of those really start putting out stuff around '96, so I think they're probably listening to all of it. Plus, there's also like a distinct like black metal riff in the middle of that. Like within that sort of Swedish melodic black death milieu, like a simplified dissection or a sacramentum type riff figure.
Oh, it's pretty complex. I think it's contrapuntal, like some of the best. The melodies are kind of like sacramentum. It's got this really cool counterpoint going on. I feel like, yeah, that's like a cool, sophisticated Swedish black death riff.
Yeah, no, it's really cool, and it's immediate, but still it doesn't break the flow of this music at all. It feels completely natural, And the synth stuff that's going on is just outstanding. It's rare that the synths really step into the forefront of this record, but once you start hearing those awesome sort of piano lines kicking in, it's like, oh, this is great. And I love the idea that so many elements on this record are used so sparingly and used as moments of serious punctuation. It really helps present this album as just this very complete work. You know, there is no sense on this album that it would benefit from any modification. You know?
No, that's absolutely true.
It's just, it is exactly what it is supposed to be. And, you know, it's like, you know, I wrote in the notes, this is such a strange record to talk about because extreme metal, for the most part, is not a genre that works like this. It is not. Extreme metal is iterative in a profound way. It is a constant process of like slowly expanding upon established tradition. It's vanishingly rare that you see something emerge that's so far outside of that conceit. And you wouldn't even want a plurality of records like that because we have a system in place. You know what I mean? But the fact that something like
also, if people could do that, they just would.
Yeah, well, I think they could, but I think most people don't have good enough ideas to justify it.
Well, no, that's what I mean. Like, if, you know, like, most people cannot do it, and if they tried doing it, it would sound like garbage. I mean, you know, like, metal is by and large more conducive to producing musical newness than indie rock is because it's based on tradition rather than progress. And indie rock ideas of progress means that everyone is always trying to one-up the bands before them and try to do something that nobody's heard before and try to progress between from our second album to our third. And, you know, like, it means that there's very superficial kinds of games of genre mixing and matching and form exaggerating, and it's a focus way more on new style than on on generating style out of substance, right? That's why you get all these bands that are not songwriting driven, and so metal normally, but this is so metal in part works because it's brings forth new stuff reliably because everyone's listening carefully to the tradition, and in many ways trying to imitate it. This band has listened really carefully to the tradition, and they've just managed to bring forth something that is just like really, really unique.
So completely fucking left field.
Yeah, this is, I guarantee, like, this was more progressive than like any indie record progressive. This is like more original than pretty much any indie rock that came out in 2000. I don't know, maybe Kid A. Yeah. Also, Kid A is also from 2000. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. It was a very good year. Also, again, Tomas Korn is just completely in fucking sicko mode here. I fucking Tomas's fucking drum performance across this entire record is so over energized in such a cool way. It doesn't fucking matter if it's the most delicate, clean guitar passage in the world. He's gonna just like grind out a hyper blast or some super intricate break beat over it. It never stops. It's so cool.
Yes.
I don't have a good way to wrap up my drifting monologue there apart from that. I love everything about this album, man.
Yeah, it's awesome. Well, you know, the keyboards will segue to our last sample, I think. We've got so this is the one track on this is basically, you could call it the synth outro, but that's missing the point because it is maybe the longest track by far the longest track on the record.
Yeah.
It's called Walking in the Garden of Ma'at, who is the Egyptian goddess of the dead. And this is the one track that's not written by Petr. It seems like it's probably written, And it's not written by the session keyboardist either. It's written by Yuri Tomanek, who I guess also eventually joined Cult of Fire, but long, long after the other guys were in Cult of Fire. So he's also, he may have been doing electronic or keyboard-driven stuff, and that's not listed on Metal Archives for him, would be my guess.
There's a lot of strange lineup questions I have about this whole record.
Yeah, he's like, this guy's work on keyboards is fantastic and very different from symphonic metal keyboards. It's a lot more like kosmische music or neoclassical or the most neoclassical parts of a Coil record. So let's listen to this. The album is going here is the interesting thing, right? We were talking before about, virtue or goodness being concrete, right? Like actual personality characteristics or just a actual place, right? Here's the actual place. Yeah, so on a musical level, what you said during while we were listening obviously holds true.
that it wipes the floor with all dungeon synth ever.
Yeah, I can't really... I mean, Honestly, the first Mortis is surprisingly sophisticated and cool.
Oh,
but,
that predates Dungeon Synth.
That's true. That's
doesn't
true.
count,
By Dungeon Synth, we mean the things that are mocking those things.
Yeah.
So, yes, this is absolutely crushes all of Dungeon Synth. I mean, yeah, that's a fucking piece of music. Who knows where that guy is now?
Well, it's awesome because it's major key and yet it floats without resolution. You know, it's
That's where I was going.
Yeah. Oh, sorry to scoop you. Go for it, man.
No. That's all. It's what's good that I have independently verified results. It is so. It gestures towards like you get to this sort of a classic yearning kind of figure that yearns towards resolution at around the 3 minutes into it, and then again about 30 seconds before the end, you get that da 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 da, right? And there are things like that are kind of like that's drawing on stuff in Wagner. You could trace it back to like say stuff in Tristan, these longing, falling themes. But it becomes a trope in film music and things like that. And there it's much closer to film music or even to sort of like schlocky pop music. Right? And you sort of, there's a moment where like, the first time I heard this, I was like, oh, is it about to get bad? Like, is it about to like do the schmaltzy resolution that it could go to? And it resolves, but in this sort of just powerful descend to root note way. And then just almost just as it's resolving, there is immediately this like noble ascending melody. Da, 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 da. And that climbs in the way that this like really sort of elegant processional sounding stuff in, say, a Coil record, like First 5 Minutes After Death, or there's a corresponding, the Golden Coil, the Gold. What is it? The Golden what?
Yeah, it's definitely got that kind of crypto martial industrial thing going on.
I was gonna say that's weirdly that's almost the most warlike part on the record.
Yeah,
that's like a very sort of, even though it's major key, that's a very martial, stern melody. But it's happiness. And that passes us up into another section of these sort of sighing, gliding, lingering chords, and then it does it again. And at the end there, as we cut out, it's just sort of like blossoming. It sort of resolves, but in this kind of like really active way. So we never get this sort of like stupid, sugary payoff kind of riff that is... that, like, I don't know, is now somehow endemic in black metal of all places. And what else is to be said about it? Well, this track exemplifies what you mean about Shades of Happiness.
Yeah, and that, you know, it expresses through the way it's composed. You know, again, the sort of rejection of the popular concept of happiness, as is expressed in music or as is expressed culturally in a lot of places, that happiness and goodness are not things that are consumed and disposed of. The melody does not conclude in the way we imagine it, because it is a state that can be eternal.
That's something, yeah. So this gets at something else I want to talk about. So on the one hand, right, you've got this, well, we're talking about vulnerability here, right? And that doesn't just mean like vulnerable in the sense of like willing to open yourself up and you know, part of vulnerability that you'd have throughout the record is like boldness, right? Yeah. Daring. Part of it's also willing to risk things in talking about things that make you vulnerable, right? Yeah.
Or it's its own form of bravery, you know.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So there's that. There's that kind of bravery that allows intimacy with people, right? And this last track is very much about intimacy. This is the kind of happiness that you experience with your, maybe with your family or with your, your true love. Right? This is, or, with people who are very close to you. And so there's those kinds of vulnerability, and there's also this kind of like metaphysical vulnerability. There's all this other kind of vulnerability, which is like, I mean, obviously most of us listening to this are in some degree of the depressed scale. I mean, the death metal guy and I think, are both pretty high in our own ways on that scale. Death metal guy has had crippling major depression. I'm just depressed every day. Right, I'm dysthymic. But it's sort of, although you just had major depression every day for years. But the point is, like, we're very in tuned to a kind of darker side of the world. And embracing that darker side of the world is one way of dealing with suffering. Right? Not running from it and seeking happiness, or it's not running from it through utopianism or through cowardice or whatever. You sort of you affirm the possibility, you affirm the strife and violence and and the loss that's in the world, right? And you're able to you find this center to you, and you can bear pretty much anything, or anything, really. And that's the black metal way of being, that's a black metal way of existing. But there are other kinds of strength, right? And they're also important and complementary. And, if you can, like, at least, maybe I'm being kind of personal here, but like for me at least, a certain kind of happy music has been difficult because I've always thought of the impermanence of those states. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, especially music like this that could be sort of tender, sweet, that can evoke sort of childhood, gentleness, things that, I don't know, things that might seem, states that might seem passing and sort of,
ephemeral and sort of like put away as we've gotten older. Yeah.
And also harder to find as you get older, and also sort of threatened by things, right? Mm-hmm. If it's in romance, right? Maybe threatened the threat of loss, right? Losing this person or whatever, right? And more than that, like, even just in the most basic way that, like, things from the world are constant, even if you just have a wonderful, very steady thing, things in the world are constantly threatening that happiness and stability, right? Mm-hmm. You're constantly going to be faced with troubles and with all sorts of problems, and you're not always going to be at your best mentally. Sometimes you'll just be, I tend to be extraordinarily negative as a reflexive thing. So do you?
Yeah, it's our automatic. Paradoxically, it's our comfort zone.
Exactly. It's a paradoxical comfort zone, and like, give me, a thought of something going well, and I'll think of it going wrong, right? Or give me, anything like that. And to some degree, right, there are healthy ways that, you can be, the black metal thing of, understanding that shit can go wrong, and that's not a complaint against the world, and that it will go wrong. But there's this other way of just being reflexively negative, which makes it hard to enjoy things, and can be a kind of fear. Oh, I can't have the happy thing because it might be impermanent, right? I don't want to linger on that because that'll just remind me of happy things I had in the past.
It'll exacerbate my disappointment when worst comes to worst.
Yes, yeah. Oh, I don't want to get too excited about it. Yeah. I don't want to, like, linger on happy music because the world's not a happy place and I need to be ready for anything, right? And
turning into fucking Henry Rollins,
Yeah, well, it's exactly. But Fucking Henry Rollins, what a joke. But but yeah, we in our sprawling philosophical music review, we always have time to make fun of Henry Rollins. But yeah, so I hope that gives people an idea of what I mean. That like there's like a vulnerability. There's maybe like, I don't know, as stupid as it sounds, guys like us can have a fear of being happy.
Oh yeah.
And I think I certainly have. I mean, I have had that, and to some degree I still have it, but
same,
much less than I used to. Yeah, much less than I used to. And this record is about, and you know, I've always been able to embrace, like, say, right, you know, the fearsome happiness in black metal, right? You know, sort of, you know, like the battle joy, or the sort of like triumphant force of nature, or whatever like that, obviously, right?
Yeah.
But like, you know, like Odal is happy, right?
Because,
but Odal,
because that's couched in it's couched in concepts of sort of strength and aggression that we're used to kind of dealing with things through.
Yeah, exactly. It's not. Yes, that is a. You can say that some of that stuff is happy, but it's still within this sort of martial and sort of force-driven worldview. But this is just like tender and intimate and sweet and vulnerable. And this song is about like being in the afterlife, right? Whether you're contacting it for a moment or just getting there. There are feelings of nostalgia, I think, here, or at least sort of, you know, like looking back on the past, which is, and having some satisfaction in it. There's feelings of like, yeah, just extreme gentleness and tenderness, yearning. But here, all of those feelings are also being gratified. And I think that's the other important thing, right? If this record were just about, if this song, say, suggested just impermanence, right? Then it would be capital R romantic and very modern. Mm-hmm. It would be like, oh, all we have is these passing joys, and we have to appreciate them, and maybe we can preserve them in imagination and art, or aspire to them. And that would be that whole kind of moralistic worldview we were talking about at the beginning of the show.
Yeah.
But this is different. This record and this track in particular affirms that some things, say, the kind of high happiness that you have with your true love or your family or maybe your closest friends, is not lost. Some things are not lost, and certainly that is not. And this record sort of affirms the existence of this, abiding, permanent world that can burst through into our own.